Chapter 25. The remainder of that day was spent trying to repair what damage had been done during the battle. Tabitha's gift for healing became very important as she ran from stretcher to stretcher healing the wounded. Not all of them were healed by the power of Moriah, and neither Tabitha nor Eli could say why some were and some were not. Jeroboam brought his prisoners to the dungeon, where he saw to it that they would be treated well despite the circumstances. Of course, the food was being rationed throughout the whole castle until the siege was lifted, but Jeroboam made sure that his prisoners received their fair share. He even took time to try to convince the prisoners to ask the king for mercy, telling them that they would be welcomed as members of the kingdom. But it was evident that they first wanted to see which way the war would go before they picked sides. Melchizedek called once more for a council. Reuben, Jeroboam, Daniel, Sarah, Tobias, Joab, and Eli met in the throne room. The council was noticeably diminished from the last one and more somber. "We have suffered many losses during the battle," Melchizedek said, "but I believe that it is a battle that we have won. The enemy has retreated for now, and will surely have to come up with a new strategy to defeat us. I thank you for your loyalty." "Your Majesty, if I may," Reuben said, "we are all prepared to die for you." "And I for you," Melchizedek answered. "Now, what is our strategy going forward?" "I believe the giants have abandoned the battle," Joab said. "I doubt they believed in it much anyway. They did not inflict much damage to the walls, and neither did the catapults." "My men are surveying the walls as we speak," Reuben broke in. "I believe our most vulnerable point is where the tower fell. It has left us without a good vantage point on that whole section of wall. I've ordered extra men to guard that area." "It is possible that the enemy has retreated for good," Joab continued, "but I doubt it. They have everything to gain and nothing to lose, and, despite their losses, they still vastly outnumber us. Their greatest weakness is their lack of order. This is why our surprise attack this morning was so effective. They do not respond well to commands. They are undisciplined. They are disobedient and do not trust their leaders. And they are all seeking their own gain. And there is a total lack of trust between the men and the dragons." "How many dragons are left?" Daniel asked. "Tough to say for sure," Reuben said. "There were 7 this morning. 1 fell inside the castle, dead. Mammon was killed. Ra was killed. At least 1 other was injured. So, maybe 3 or 4? "More than I would like," Daniel grumbled. "What of our men outside the walls?" "I had to choose to close the gate at some point," Reuben began. "I understand," Daniel said. "But did they survive?" Reuben began again. "It is safe to assume that they did not," Joab said. "I was in the middle of the fray down there, and though I understand that from the outskirts men were fleeing, they fought viciously in the middle. They are not men who take prisoners." "It's too bad they're not," Jeroboam said, "because we have several. I would have liked to arrange for a prisoner exchange." "They did take me prisoner," Sarah said, "with hopes of persuading me to join them. Perhaps—" "Their cunning and deceit is the dragon's most powerful weapon," Daniel said. "However, from what I saw, the most cunning of the dragons are dead. Until we hear otherwise, it is best to assume that our friends are dead." With that, the assembly took a moment of silence. "So what do we do?" asked Tobias. "We wait," Daniel said. "We cannot predict their next move." "I hate being caught on the defensive," Joab said. "Being reactive. We won the last battle because we did something unexpected. If we are going to defeat this enemy, we have to act before they do." "Perhaps we could sneak into their camp and spy on them?" Tobias suggested. "I'm sure they are watching the walls, and the village has been flattened," Joab argued. "We'd never get close." "Hezekiah's tunnel," Tobias said. "It leads to the forest, and I left armor and a horse there. With any luck, they'll still be there." "I hate all the traffic through the tunnel," Reuben said, "but it seems like it might work." "All right, Tobias," Joab said. "I'm going with you." At this point, a discussion broke out as to who would be best to go on such a dangerous mission, who would be hardest to recognize, whether it was appropriate for women to go on such missions at all, much less princesses, and whether Tobias ever meant that he himself should go. In the end, it was decided that Tobias, Joab, and Jeroboam would go. With that, the council ended. The rest of the day passed without incident. Everyone rested as well as they could. Eli led a prayer service for the dead and officiated over a funeral of sorts. For the time being, the bodies were placed respectfully in a storage room under the wall. In the evening, Tobias, Joab, and Jeroboam met together in the room adjacent to Hezekiah's tunnel. Reuben and Sarah also came to see them off. The king had already given them his blessing in the throne room. Ratzes was irritated by the fact that they were once again using the tunnel, but besides grumbling to himself about protocol and procedure, he gave no resistance. Sarah took Tobias aside. "Promise me you will spy and come back. You will not attempt to sabotage anything or do anything to get caught." "I can only promise you this much," Tobias answered. "Insofar as it depends on me, I will do what is right for you and for the kingdom." With that, he kissed her lightly on the forehead, and he, Joab, and Jeroboam descended into the tunnel. It was dark, and for the first part of the journey they carried torches. They were mostly unarmed. Each carried only a dagger. It would be impossible to swim with more than what they had. When they got to the place where they had to dive into the water, all three were having second thoughts. The water was cold and dark. Could Tobias find his way back through? The men looked at each other, and then one by one they extinguished their torches, and together dove into the water. Not only was it harder to find the channel this way, Tobias had not counted on the current. Moreover, he had forgotten just how cold the water was. As he dove down the 45-degree tunnel, his chest constricting and ears popping, he moved as fast as he could, desperate for air at the other end. When they surfaced at the other end, they pulled themselves onto the shore, gasping for air. The sun was setting, but the air was still warm. Nonetheless, they shivered in their wet clothes. A quick examination of the forest revealed that Tobias' armor still lay where it had been hidden, and there did not seem to be anyone around. Rua was nowhere to be seen. They quickly built a fire to dry their clothes by and to weigh their options. "I say we distribute the armor evenly," Jeroboam said. "That way we each at least have some degree of armor." "We would not be a very effective spies wearing shining gold armor," Joab pointed out. "Maybe we could disguise it. Smudge it in mud and ashes," Jeroboam suggested. "Seems impious to me," Tobias said. "This armor belonged to the great Michael of old. He should be treated with honor." "As the armor of Michael, I could think of no greater honor to give it than to wear it now into battle," Joab said. Then, assuming the role of commander, he said, "I will wear the breastplate. Jeroboam, you take the shield. Tobias, you will be most easily recognized, having stood upon the balcony during the last battle. You take the helmet. The sword too is yours, as you have demonstrated already that you know how to use it." That settled, the three men decided that it was best to move on. They smeared mud and ash onto their armor and suited up. Their clothes were still damp, and they moved stiffly through the forest. To their left, across the lake, they could see the lights of the castle, the ruins of what had been the village, the silhouettes of trebuchets against the night sky, and the enemy camp. The camp was active. Men were moving about, shouting instructions. The statue of Moloch had the furnace in its belly stoked, and was spouting flames out of its mouth. The statue rested still on the log rollers, but in the dark they could see large animals fastened to it to pull it towards the castle. Our three men were shocked to discover that the animals were dragons, harnessed to the weight like cattle to a plow. They were bound by strong chains, their wings chained down to their backs, and their mouths muzzled. Tobias recognized among them the dragon upon which Jezebel had ridden. The other three were recognizable as having also been in the procession earlier. Men with whips stood on either side of the dragons, prepared to begin a new type of procession upon command. "What do you think?" Jeroboam whispered. "They're going to send the dragons to the castle as a peace offering? Maybe in exchange for the prisoners?" "Doubtful," Joab said. "Looks to me like the men have turned against their former masters, and want to use the ones who once used them." Men driving wagons loaded with what looked like stones under blankets passed close by, taking their wares to the catapults and trebuchets. They will attack again tonight, Joab said. We haven't much time to discover their plan. What do you suggest? Tobias asked. We could continue to lie here in the bush, observing what we can, Joab said, or we could try to walk among them and pass for one of them. In my experience, if you walk boldly and act like you know what you are doing, people generally assume that you do. It was fortunate for them that the enemy wore whatever armor was available to them, so there was no uniform or consistency among them. Men walked around the camp, drinking and talking loudly. It was not at all well guarded. Tobias, Joab, and Jeroboam began moving among the men, catching what they could of the plans from the conversations at the fires. Joab was bolder than his two friends. He even sat at a fire and joined the men there in conversation. Tobias and Jeroboam explored further. About time those dragons got what was coming to them, one man at the fire was saying. I was getting sick of them hovering over us like vultures. I think Sanballat's waiting the whole time for his chance to take over, another said. Why else would a man like that listen to these lizards? Sanballat is a genius, a third man said. Tonight we will strike terror into the kingdom like they've never known. They'll be so weak, they'll beg Sanballat to take the throne. So the conversation went. The details of the plan were not discussed, but the men were quite excited about the terror they would bring upon the castle. There was also talk of a sacrifice, a move that was met with somewhat less approval by the men, yet they all conceded it would deepen the fear. They then changed the discussion to the spoils of war and what they would do once they were made citizens of the kingdom. Their conversation was so base, their intentions so dark, that it became more apparent to Joab than ever that his enemy must be defeated. They spoke dishonorably about their intentions towards the women, and particularly Sarah and Queen Miriam. Joab felt his blood pressure rising. He had held his tongue, only contributing laughter where necessary to seem more like one of the men. But now he wanted to lash out. Any man who spoke in such a manner about the queen should be killed on the spot. But before he could decide how to react, Tobias came for him and gestured for him to follow. At this point, the men stopped talking and looked quizzically at the two. But then someone made another joke about the queen, and they began laughing again. As Tobias led Joab through the camp, Joab said, These men must be stopped at all costs. They walked to the edge of the camp, where they met up with Jeroboam, who was hiding around the edge of a tent. So much for walking boldly among them to look inconspicuous, Joab said. Shh, look, Jeroboam said, pointing to a small clearing below the camp. There they saw Ra, the king of the dragons, chained like the other dragons, with the great collar around his neck fastened to two trees. Each of his 4 limbs had been chained and were stretched in 4 directions. His mouth was chained shut, and the wounds where his wings had been ripped off were burnt in a crude effort to stop the flow of blood. Guess he didn't die after all, Joab said. Near him were 6 men, all chained with their arms behind their backs and bound to trees. They wore black bags over their heads, and they appeared to be gagged. We think Gideon is among the prisoners, Jeroboam said. These must be all that survived. Which one do you think is Gideon? Joab asked. If you number them 1 to 6, starting with the one nearest us, he'd be 4, Jeroboam answered. Look at his clothes and his build. It was hard to see for sure in the wavering firelight, but it seemed likely enough. Are they guarded? Joab asked. Yes, there are 4 guards around the perimeter of this makeshift jail, Jeroboam said. And of course, the dragon, chained in such a way that it can't help but stare at the prisoners. We have to free them, Joab said. What did you learn from the men by the fire? Tobias asked. I'm not sure. I think they will attack tonight. Something about terror. I think they intend to use fear itself as a weapon. A very potent weapon, Tobias said. We must go back and warn the king. There's no time, Joab said. They are almost ready to mobilize even as they speak. We have an opportunity here to free these prisoners. We must do that. Suddenly the drums began beating and the call went out from within the camp. Form ranks! Form ranks! We can't blend in once they form ranks, Joab said. Let's move. Joab led his 2 companions into the forest behind the prisoners. Chapter 26. Reuben walked around the perimeter of the castle checking his guards. Most were resting, leaving just a skeleton crew on. which was good. He needed all his guards to be alert once the fighting resumed. The night was uneasy, a steady wind was blowing, and it looked as though there may be a storm coming in. The wind would be to his advantage, as it was blowing towards the enemy camp. It wouldn't make much difference against the catapults, but when arrows were fired, his would fly further than those of his enemies. The flags flapped violently and the wind howled through the nearby forest. Storms always made Reuben feel excited and uneasy. In all his training and that which he provided for his men, they had never considered what a war would be like in the midst of a thunderstorm, and this looked like it could be a violent one. There was only occasional lightning and the distant rumble of thunder, but the clouds themselves, or rather the cloud, as it all seemed to be one great mass imposing itself on the otherwise clear and starry sky, the cloud hung heavy and tall, like a great flying mountain. "Perhaps it'll buy us some time," Reuben said to one of his guards who was observing the clouds. Indeed, that would be to their advantage. They had sent out spies, but among these was Joab, their general. With Gideon dead, this left them without a general in the event of a war. Reuben hoped that Melchizedek would once again be the warrior king he once was, rather than simply stand and observe from some balcony. He supposed that if Melchizedek would not lead the troops, then he himself would have to. But he was not a strategist, at least for battle. He was a defender. The earlier battle was won because Joab had gone on the offense, but all that Reuben knew was defense. Reuben's men on the walls were alert. The coming storm had put them on edge, but this too would prove to be in their favor. Their heightened awareness and reaction speed would prevail against a surprise attack. Reuben decided to check further on the entrance to Hezekiah's tunnel. To get to that hidden chamber, one first had to pass by guards who stood in the hallways of the castle. The halls were where food and weapons were stored, so they did not seem to be a likely entrance or exit point for the castle. The chamber above the tunnel could only be accessed through a hidden doorway in the back of the armory. In this way, the secret location of the chamber was well kept. However, on this night the halls were unguarded. This bothered Reuben, but he made it a policy always to assume the best in others. Rather than guess that his guards were lazy, he assumed that when he ordered all unnecessary men to get some rest, that they thought it included them. After all, their primary job was to defend from within the castle against any who would access the food or weapons without authorization. Nonetheless, at least one guard should have been monitoring the area. Stranger yet, when he made his way through the armory, passing by the secret entrance at the back and into the chamber at the head of Hezekiah's tunnel, there were again no guards. Ratzis of all people would know not to leave the tunnel unguarded. Reuben had a sinking feeling as he approached the stairs leading down to the tunnel. Still, no one. He grabbed the torch off the wall, which still burned brightly, and descended the stairs. There, to his shock and horror, he saw the bodies of Ratzis and the 3 guards floating face down in the water. They had been murdered. Reuben now grabbed his sword, lest he should confront the murderer in the tunnel or the chamber above. There were a million places where he could hide. The murderer would have passed right through the armory with every sort of weapon at his disposal. Was he an insider or an outsider? Was there more than one? Reuben had no way of knowing. Clearly the enemy had found the tunnel, but it would have to be much better guarded now. Moreover, someone could simply poison the water. Reuben moved swiftly, though cautiously, back through the armory and down the hallway leading to the various storage rooms. Murderers could be hiding in any one of them. He had to act swiftly. He went first to the guards' barracks and made all the guards wake up and begin taking posts inside the castle. Several men were designated to search the storage chambers, while others were to move throughout the castle and look for intruders. From there, Reuben himself went to the throne room to alert the king. There were no guards by the entrance to the throne room. He pushed open the large doors. The room was completely empty. Men came racing in behind him. The guards had in turn awakened the police and the soldiers, so that every man was on full alert. "Spread out," Reuben ordered them. "Look in every room and closet. Find the intruders. Any bodies you find, report them to me." He moved next to check the king's personal chambers. He was relieved to see guards in place when he arrived. "Has there been any movement in this area?" he asked. "I don't know, sir," the guard answered. "We were in the barracks when you came in. We spread out as you ordered and discovered this entranceway unguarded." "Keep watch here," Reuben ordered. "If more men arrive, send them to search these rooms." "These are the king's private quarters," the guard argued. "I know," Reuben said. Just then Daniel came running over, wearing his bedclothes.
"What's going on? I heard there were intruders. Has the king been informed?"
"I'm looking for him now," Reuben answered. "Come on." The two men raced down the hallway to the king's room. The door was not latched, but swung open on a touch. "Get some light in here," Reuben said, lighting the torches on the walls. Light revealed an empty room. The bed was made, and everything was in its place. There was no sign of a struggle, and yet neither was there any sign of the king or the queen. A quick search of the chapel and adjacent rooms revealed the same. Reuben was blinking back tears. "We must find them," he said. Sarah was unable to sleep. She'd given her bed over to Magdalena, her adopted sister, who slept soundly. Sarah had found it easy to forgive the girl, and even felt sorry for her. She wondered what would become of the children who had been with her. She walked for a time in her private garden, enjoying the night air. A storm was coming. She was afraid for Tobias out in enemy territory. She wished he hadn't gone. She asked herself several times why it had to be him out there, and not someone less important. But she knew that he above anyone knew how to deal with dragons. Her garden had been damaged, and she began to feel uncomfortable in it. It was here that she had first met with dragons, and had even thought that they were trustworthy. She felt now that she had been very naive. She wished there was some way to purge the thought of them from her mind, to restore her garden to what it had been. The wind whipped her, and she felt cold, so she moved inside, down the hall to her room. Inside it was warmer, and the darkness had a soothing effect. Magdalena's breathing was rhythmic in sleep. She quietly locked the door and went to the window to watch the coming storm. Below her she could see the castle's inner court, which had been transformed into a sort of refugee camp. Villagers slept in every plot of ground possible, indoors and out. But babies cried, and there was a murmur of talk. It was too crowded in the inner court, so for sleeping purposes many families had been moved back into the outer court, though in the event of an attack they would be more vulnerable. Along the castle walls men were running, coming together, spreading out, looking for something. They were careful not to disturb the sleeping villagers as they did so. However, Sarah noticed the activity increasing. Suddenly there was a sound at her door, metal on wood. It was quiet, subtle, not enough to wake Magdalena. It was not the sound of a key. Someone was trying to pry her door open. Her heart raced. From the nearby desk she grabbed a letter opener shaped like a small sword. Then she retreated into the shadows by her curtains. The door slowly opened, and at first nothing happened. A moment later, a man dressed in dark leather quietly entered the room. He moved so swiftly and quietly that he made no noise. He passed very briefly through the moonlight, and Sarah recognized the man. It was Sisera. He approached the bed and pulled out a dagger. He hesitated just a moment when he saw that the girl sleeping in the bed was not Sarah. At that moment, moving even more swiftly and quietly than the would-be assassin, Sarah came from behind, grabbed Sisera by the neck, and plunged her letter opener into his right temple. Tobias, Joab, and Jeroboam cut back into the forest to go around the clearing. They had to go in pretty deep to avoid detection by the guards. They would enter the prisoners' camp from behind the dragon, and kill the dragon if necessary. A steady wind had been picking up for some time, and now was blowing strongly from the direction of the castle. Joab observed that a big storm was blowing in. "Good," Jeroboam said. "The wind is blowing in our faces. Besides muffling our sounds, maybe the dragon won't smell us coming." There was only one guard at the rear of the clearing, and he was watching the storm and the soldiers form ranks, so he had his back to them. Thus it was not difficult for Tobias to approach him from the rear, place the edge of his sword against the man's throat. "One word and you're dead," Tobias whispered. "Drop your weapons." The man did as he was told, and Joab and Jeroboam came out of the forest as well, brandishing their daggers. Jeroboam took the man's sword, while Joab gagged him. "How do we take care of the dragon?" Jeroboam whispered. "I don't think we can easily kill it," Tobias said. "Not without attracting attention."
The army once had to remove several crocodiles from the river, Joab suggested. To capture them, 2 men would lasso the creatures from either side, holding it steady, while a third would come at it from behind and cover its eyes. The croc would calm down sufficiently, and they could bind its mouth shut. The dragon is already chained in such a way that it can barely move, and its mouth is bound. If we covered its eyes, perhaps it would be calm enough to let us free the prisoners.
Seems crazy, but we might as well try it, Tobias said. If it doesn't work, we'll have to kill it. So large was the dragon that it required 2 men, one from each side, to cover its eyes. This would only free up 1 man to help the prisoners. Tobias and Jeroboam, each with a sword, quietly crept up behind the dragon, close to the beast's body. Then each covered one of its great eyes with their hand.
Peekaboo,
Ra said. 1 word and you're dead, Jeroboam said.
Tobias already used that line,
Ra told him. They quickly realized that covering the dragon's eyes was a foolish plan, so they abandoned it for a more obvious one. Jeroboam would guard the animal and, if necessary, kill it. Tobias and Joab set to work, freeing the prisoners. Joab went first to the man they had suspected was Gideon. They were right. Gideon had a wide gash in his forehead, and his face was bruised and swollen. But he smiled through cracked lips when he saw them. Once Joab had unbound him, they took the guard they had gagged and placed him in Gideon's place, tied up with a bag over his head. Too bad you don't have 5 more guards, Gideon said as they went about freeing the others. Maybe no one would know we'd escaped at all. I'm sure the dragon would say something, Jeroboam said. Even with his mouth bound, he can't keep it shut.
If I was going to ruin your plan, Ra began, I would have done so. I saw you at the tents.
You have very impressive senses, Jeroboam said, irritation in his voice.
I am more interested in seeing your plan succeed at this point, Ra continued.
Tobias moved close to Jeroboam and whispered, Never dialogue with the dragon. Ignore him.
I can hear you, Ra said.
I know you can, Tobias started, then caught himself. Never talk to them, he repeated to Jeroboam. Then he went on working at the knots on the other prisoners.
And that summarizes your kingdom's foreign policy, Ra said. Never talk to anyone, unless you can be assured that he already agrees with you. Well, you can see where this has gotten you. An army that I would estimate to be about 3 times the size of your own has laid siege to your castle, and even now are preparing to fire their catapults. Your village is already destroyed, and I'd be surprised if your people survive the night. Too bad your king had refused to listen to me and my messengers.
Like you're any better off, Jeroboam muttered.
Precisely why you should listen to me. Or has it not yet occurred to you that we have a common enemy? Sanballat and his men have injured me far more grievously than your king ever had. Not to mention the giants. They've left, by the way, but I should have no trouble finding them and exterminating their race.
You cannot fly, Jeroboam pointed out. Besides, I have my doubts that you'll ever taste freedom, whoever wins this war.
Let me clue you into something, Ra said condescendingly. I'm not interested in you humans and your politics. I'm only interested in watching you destroy one another. And you are so easily manipulated into doing so. I engineered this war. I brought about the banishment of all these men in the first place. For all your talk of nobility and honor and virtue, you'll abandon it very easily with the right carrot. Even you, Jeroboam, I know who you are. You were once one of our slaves, and now you're one of his. Oh, noble hero who still cannot think for himself. Whereas I was never anyone's slave. Even chained here now, wings torn off by some massive brute, stupidity incarnate. Even now I am more free than you because my thoughts are free and clear, and yours are muddled by some desire to do someone else's will, which will always remain unclear. But pathetic as your little mind is, surely you recognize this. I have more to gain in aiding you to destroy Sanballat than in aiding him. All I care about is the suffering and destruction of your sniveling, disgusting race, and on my terms, Sanballat will have something to sniffle about. Free me from these chains, and I will help you.
That's ridiculous, Jeroboam argued. You started this war. You yourself said you engineered the whole thing. Now you plan to switch sides?
I never switched sides, Ra said. I have always sought my own advantage. Right now, my advantage is to get revenge against Sanballat and his men. It just so happens that my advantage and your advantage are aligned now. Let us help each other. Jeroboam considered this for a moment. Do you swear that if we free you, you will aid my people and never harm the kingdom of Moriah? That you will, after this war, pursue the giants or whomever you like, but you will never return to this region? I solemnly swear it, the dragon said. Then suddenly Ra became agitated. Quickly, now, free me before it is too... And he raised his head as far as the chains would allow, and let out a slow gurgling hiss. His body spasmed, and he gasped, and his body collapsed dead on the ground. Tobias jumped down from the dragon's back, from where he had plunged his sword deep into the back of its neck, angled into its head. Never talk to dragons, he said.